Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the LEAF webinar. Whether you're joining us from Lagos, Nigeria, or Nairobi, or Rwanda, or just anywhere around Africa, or even all over the world, you're welcome to the webinar session today. We are going to be discussing an important subject about borrowing. A lot of persons are interested. We see the comments coming from our social media platforms. People are interested in understanding how public debt affects, different sectors and how African leaders can also borrow smartly. So this conversation today is in two parts. The first part would be the debate session. We have Temitope and Ilerioluwa to do justice to that session. And afterwards, would move into the webinar proper. Thank you all for joining us for this insightful session, and we hope that you stick around to the end because we have a lot to discuss today. We're going to be touching on different points, how debt affects different economies, how it affects different sectors, and also how it affects the quality of living of, the masses. So at the end of this conversation, we know that you're going to pick whether you're an entrepreneur or you're an investor or even a policymaker, you're going to pick different points that will be insightful for you to make, informed decisions around your work. We are going to be starting shortly. Please give us a few minutes. We'll be starting shortly. Stick around and, make yourself at home, grab some water, grab some popcorn, grab tea, or just grab anything that would keep you awake, listening into the session from start to finish. Thank you all for joining again.
Connects entrepreneurs, investors, and policymakers to drive transformative change. Our mission to empower African entrepreneurs, amplify their voices, and create actionable pathways for growth. We're not just addressing today's challenges, we're building tomorrow's opportunities. Through innovation, collaboration, and trust, we're fostering a culture of progress that benefits everyone, whether you're an entrepreneur ready to scale, an investor seeking impactful opportunities, or a policymaker driving change. LEAF is your partner in growth and innovation. Together, let's transform challenges into stepping stones for progress. This is LEAF, your gateway to Africa's economic future. Africa is a continent brimming with potential, innovation, and opportunity, but unlocking its full power requires connection, collaboration, and forward-thinking vision. At Leaf Africa, we are reimagining Africa's economic future. We are the bridge that connects entrepreneurs, investors, and policymakers to drive transformative change. Our mission to empower African entrepreneurs, amplify their voices, and create actionable pathways for growth. We're not just addressing today's challenges, we're building tomorrow's opportunities. Through innovation, collaboration, and trust, we're fostering a culture of progress that benefits everyone, whether you're an entrepreneur ready to scale, an investor seeking impactful opportunities, or a policymaker driving change. LEAF is your partner in growth and innovation. Together, let's transform challenges into stepping stones for progress. This is LEAF, your gateway to Africa's economic future. Africa is a continent brimming with potential, innovation, and opportunity, but unlocking its full power requires connection, collaboration, and forward-thinking vision. At Leaf Africa, we are reimagining Africa's economic future. We are the bridge that connects entrepreneurs, investors, and policymakers to drive transformative change. Our mission to empower African entrepreneurs, amplify their voices, and create actionable pathways for growth. We're not just addressing today's challenges, we're building tomorrow's opportunities. Through innovation, collaboration, and trust, we're fostering a culture of progress that benefits everyone, whether you're an entrepreneur ready to scale, an investor seeking impactful opportunities, or a policymaker driving change. LEAF is your partner in growth and innovation. Together, let's transform challenges into stepping stones for progress. This is LEAF, your gateway to Africa's economic future. Africa is a continent brimming with potential, innovation, and opportunity, but unlocking its full power requires connection.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me? Just a thumbs up. Can you all hear me? Just a thumbs up. Amara, can you hear me? Mr. Nelson, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right then. All right then. All right then. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Leaf Africa webinar on Africa's debt story, the cost of borrowing inside Africa's rising debt burdens. I'm glad to be with you here today. My name is Dabirichuku Obishi, and I'm joined by an esteemed panel, and we're looking to have a very expansive conversation on this topical issue. So just to get us started, we've already had the introduction video talking about the importance of this conversation. I know this has been of interest to everyone here, including both professional interest and otherwise. So just to get us started, since we've already had the video, just to talk a little bit about what we do at Leaf. Leaf is a data intelligence company. We're Pan-African in our view, but we are essentially seeking to understand Africa's macro story and Africa's place in the world. We have published a lot of reports on different parts of the sectors in African nations, including, of course, the cocoa report, the debt report, which we just published earlier in the year, and also country reports from South Africa to Kenya to Nigeria as well. So it's a pleasure to have everyone here on the panel. Before we get started, we'll be having a debate, and I think it's only right to set the tone by giving us a bit of background to that. So the debate will be on two sides. One side will be on debt forgiveness. The other side would be on debt restructuring, broadly speaking. And we're looking at the question, what is the more sustainable path for African economies? Debt forgiveness or debt restructuring? So we have two esteemed guests who will be panelists who will be taking this on. We have Mr. Temitope Nelson, and we have Mr. Ileorua Deniron. So before we get you guys started, ground rules. You've been given the topics, you've been given the rules to the debates. Essentially, we're looking to just have a data-grounded, statistics-backed discussion about debt forgiveness and debt restructuring. I think a bit more background to that would be sometime last year during the United Nations General Assembly, African nations went to the UN, to the UNGA, and we kept on hearing the same story. We were looking to hear, a lot of conversation around development and public-private partnerships, and collaboration across the continent. But to some analysts and some disappointments, we kept on hearing the same story around, debt forgiveness, especially from, the major players on the economy. So we are going to trash out this issue today, and hopefully we are going to get, a clearer picture of the divide. So I'll just go on to read the profiles, and we'll get us started on the debate proper. For clarification purposes, Mr. Nelson, you are on debt restructuring. Am I correct?
Yeah, very correct.
Okay, then Mr. Adeniran, you are on debt forgiveness.
Very correct, sir.
All right, thank you so much. So just to read your profiles before we get started. All right, Mr. Ileorua Adeniran is a strategist, economist, and research professional with experience spanning business strategy, capital markets, digital innovation, and economic analysis. He currently works within the finance and strategy space, where he contributes to research, policy analysis, product development, and strategic initiatives across Nigeria's financial ecosystem. Welcome to the webinar, Mr.
Thank you very much.
So over to Mr. Nelson. Mr. Temitope Nelson, just a second. So Mr. Temitope Nelson is just a second, please. Yes, so Mr. Temitope Nelson is a senior economist and business consultant with nearly a decade of experience supporting businesses, governments, and development institutions in strategic planning, economic analysis, budgeting, forecasting, and business growth. He has led projects focused on data-driven decision-making, policy analysis, research, business development, and stakeholder engagement across the public and private sectors. His expertise include economic and data analysis, strategic leadership, budgeting and forecasting, process improvements, and project management, to name a few. Mr. Nelson holds a bachelor's degree from economics at the University of Lagos and a professional certifications in business management, data analysis, and planning. His work has spanned collaboration with organizations such as UNIDO, Deloitte Nigeria, Kia Africa, Technologies, and the U.S. Consulate General in Lagos, as well as the Boston Consulting Group. He's also served with the Lagos State Government at the University of Lagos as a consultant. Thank you so much for joining us today for this program. So just to get us started, Nelson, I think you're the one to take the lead since you have part A, and you will start with your opening statement, which is just for 3 minutes. So the timer, if we can have the back room on a timer for us, then I would exit the stage and leave it all to Mr. Nelson to get us started.
All right, am I good to go?
Okay, so just 1 second so we can have the timer up. All right, I think you're good to go whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Live Africa, and to our audience in general, thank you very much for being part of this webinar section. My name is Temitope Nelson, as is rightly mentioned earlier. So today I'll be focusing on the debt restructuring in Africa, right? And why debt restructuring is very important. But to set the context rolling, what do we mean by debt restructuring? Debt restructuring is just renegotiating terms and on existing debts that a particular country or particular individual has initiated in the previous year, such as extending the maturity, reducing the interest rate, and abstracting instruments or restore to restore sustainability. So the idea is for you to look at the existing negotiation and agreement on the debt servicing or debt procurement that you have currently, and approaching your creditor to say, okay, you know what, due to the current economic realities, geopolitical realities, I would like to restructure my debt. And the essence is to ensure sustainability of that the debt repayment, and also not to impact heavily on your economic environment. Okay, so that is basically what debt restructuring is, right? But when we look at Africa today at large, right, debt has become a significant topic or conversation among economic policy analysts across the country of Africa in general, and it's becoming a major concern, right, as we have our leaders, political leaders, economic leaders going into the Western country, independent borrowers to actually request for what's it called, a loan to service their budgetary obligations or infrastructure development, and in terms of to actually improve socioeconomic and national development. So it is very important I mentioned that while we look at debt or loan, right, in its real term, it's not actually a bad steps or policy to take, but the implementation of debt and what you definitely use your debt for, it's what is critical to determine whether a particular debt or loan taking is bad or good. And then when we look at in the case of Africa in general, Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa. We'll be looking at what developments that has that debt or loan has generated over time. But in the course of this debate and everything, I'll be opening our mind into what debt restructuring is, why it is important in the African space currently, especially in this era of economic volatility, social geopolitical tension, and every socioeconomic implications that's going on around the world. And I'm very sure that we are not oblivious to this particular economic situation that is going on around the world, rising cost of goods and services, inflation, economic instability, war here and there. So I will be deep diving into these topics in a few time, and then we'll be looking at how debt restructuring is a sustainable path for African debt in general. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Nelson, on time too. So, Mr. Adeniran, over to you. Same amount of time, 4 minutes. Please stick to time. Watch the timer by your top right corner, and yeah, you can get started anytime you're ready.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, our audience, and thank you for joining the conversation this evening. The motion before us is something that is very timely because if you look at it, in the last few years, there have been a lot of going concern around African debt profile. In the last 6 years, African have accumulated over 253% increase in debt portfolio from roughly 530 billion in 2008, meaning we are now in a position where we are trapped. And the question is, do we go for renegotiation or do we go for debt restructuring, just as I said, or debt forgiveness? I stand on this, the part of debt forgiveness, because if you look at it, a lot of African countries are now trapped in a place where 90% of their revenue are now going into debt servicing. So little is left for social amenities, little is left for infrastructural development, human development across Africa continent. Now, going into the debt negotiation is something that my colleague Tim Tokora have said that, yeah, it's something we should do. But if you look at it, forgiveness of debt and in terms of writing off this debt is what African continent need right now, because over time we have seen a compounding interest on all this debt. If you take a look at the report that was shared by Leave Africa, if you look at it, Africa borrowed little compared to other European countries or United States of America as a whole, but the cost of that loan is higher on the African continent because over time the interest compounded to a certain level that African country cannot bear the burden again, and it is expected that creditors need to take a look at it and say, no, structurally wise, these countries cannot continue to pay back this debt. And it is on a good opinion, economic standpoint, that there must be debt forgiveness. And again, if you take a look at what happened in Nigeria in the last, I think during the time of Dr. Okojo Iweala, where the arrangement with Paris Claw, where Nigeria accumulated a significant amount of debt in terms of interest compounding. And if you take a look at the Nigeria fiscal economy as a whole, the GDP, the government fiscal expenditure and revenue expectation, it got to a point that taking a look at that loan as that structure as a whole, Nigeria cannot pay back. And it is adopted that His Excellency Olusegun Obasanjo come to point that there is a need for the debt forgiveness. And if you look at it, evidence shows us that Nigeria was forgiven and a significant amount of money was used for social amenities and even infrastructural development. So for African continent, Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, Kenya, and Rwanda that have been growing significantly in the last few years, but have a bottleneck of debt. It is that time that the creditor take a look at it and say that no, this African continent, with the way they are growing, they are fastest growing economies around the world, debt forgiveness, it is what is economic sound. And that is our discussion this morning, that the cost of borrowing for African country is very hard, and debt forgiveness is the right approach to see that these countries can move to a stable macroeconomic position. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Adeniran. Thank you for that. Debt forgiveness. So, Mr. Nelson, is direct rebuttal, and you have 3 minutes. So, to rebut what Mr. Adeniran has said, please stay to time, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Larry Oliver, for that sound presentation. So, okay, let's go back to statistic, right? When we look at the debt profile in the global debt profile in the world today, right? We're looking at Africa in terms of debt profile. We have just 1.9% contribution to the global debt. What does that mean to us? It means that we are not even borrowing up to the amount of or the quantity or the volume of debt that the global economy or the other countries are actually borrowing. But what is the issue, right? When we look at the disparity between the interest rate, right? When you look at developed country, the European nations, the Americas, the Chinese, the Asians, they borrow at what rate? 2 to 3%. And when you come to Africa, right, we're looking at 8.8% to 15%, which is extremely high. That's about 300 to 400% increase compared to when we are talking about this Western country. So as such, if we are asking for debt forgiveness, right, it gives our leader the leeway to continue borrowing. And in my conversation with someone last week, when we were dissecting the issue of the South Africa economic and economic situation, and I was saying that, you know what, when we look at the debt profile, especially I will be coming to my country, Nigeria, we look at debt profile, we look at how much each administration has borrowed over time, and what is the repayment strategy, what is the repayment commitment, right? And you see that in oftentimes we keep flaunting, and a larger percentage, about 28% in last year budget, about 28%, right, of revenue is going to debt servicing, which is not sustainable, right? And aside that, when you also look at it, do not forget we're paying back in an exchange rate that is unfavorable to us in the first place because our naira has been devalued, right? So if you was asking that, oh, let's forgive the debt, how much debt do you want our creditor to forgive? However, I stand on the ground that restructuring our debt, going back to these people, renegotiating the percentage rate or the interest rate on every loan that is being borrowed. Why don't we look at the example and say, look, other Western nation, European nation, they are borrowing at 2 to 3%. We in Africa, we have to renegotiate in such a way that the interest rates can come down a bit, right? And that is one example. Another example is we need to look at what exactly are we borrowing on, right? And how is the return on investment for these debts that we are accumulating?
Sorry,
Okay,
time is
my
up.
time is up.
Sorry, yes,
So
time is
I'm
up.
so passionate about it, but thank you
Yes, we
very
can
much.
see so. We can see so. Thank you so much. So, Mr. Ilerua Adeniran, you have rebuttal 3 minutes to Mr. Nelson. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Temitope. He has really mentioned something there that it is need for us to look at debt restructuring. And I would love to say that, yeah, based on what you have said, because if you look at it holistically from what has been happening in Nigeria and other African countries, debt forgiveness is really the way forward because I think you see that everything you have said earlier is a strong case for restructuring. But I want to challenge that framework on the ground that a lot of African continents, historically, we have seen that a lot of debt problems have piled up as a result of wrong economic policy. And in actual evaluation, they have seen that if what was borrowed, the money that have been borrowed have not been used for something tangible, and you want to compile a lot of debt upon this, this is the reason for the creditor to look at it and see, we need to forgive these past loans and come up with a new loan agreement that will really solve economic implications. You made mention of other European countries that borrow at 2 to 3%, where African bear the burden of 8 to 10 interest rate. Yet the GDP to debt ratio of African countries compared to others nations, there is a wide gap, and that's why a lot of these countries that have been classified as developed nations, They have the economic capability to meet certain interest rates. They have the advantage to repay back. But African countries have been classified as a risky environment, and that's why the motion for debt forgiveness is very paramount. Because if you take a loan provider that have been issued to a lot of African countries compared with other European countries, you see that the maturity set for African nations and other European countries, it's the same. If you take example, the same amount of money, but the maturity as well is still short. So from the creditor's part, also there is a lax, there is no uniformity on how loans are being structured. So the creditor has a fault on this, and that's why African countries have to come forward boldly to the creditor that see the past loan obligation have not been well structured. Rather, let's take a look at this and forgive us of this debt. Then come into a new arrangement for a fresh note, not restructuring this time around. That if there is need, because economically it has been proven that countries of the world will always have debt. There is no zero country with zero debt profile. So my argument is that for African leaders, there is need for everyone to look at it for future purposes, that when you restructure a loan, there is still burdens to bear. But for a African country to move to a development level that it will increase the livelihoods of the citizen, the past obligation need to be forgiven in order to enter into a more economic, prosperous arrangement.
All right, just on time, just on the penny. Thank you so much, Mr. Adeniran. So I'm going to allow one question each to the opposing side. So I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. So you ask a question. You don't have to, but I mean, the floor is open. You can ask one question each to the opposing side, and you reply within a minute. So I'll just give you a few seconds. And,
Okay.
we can get that started. Please mute your mics if you're not muted. Backroom, could we mute anyone who shouldn't be unmuted at this point, please? Thank you. All right, so I will take it that we all have our questions. I'll start with Mr. Nelson. The floor is yours. Then after we take Mr. Adeniran. Thank you. So just one question.
All right, thank you very much. So my question is very simple. Yeah, I know you have a very strong base argument on that, but the question is, let's go down to the perspective of Nigerian African leaders, right? Knowing fully that these people even borrowing without plans, right? Do you think that debt forgiveness will be an adequate solution, right, to improve our to reduce our debt portfolio and also to improve sustainability, putting into consideration African leader perceptions?
Okay, thank you so much. So, Mr. Adeniran, you reply within a minute. If we can get the timer started, the floor is yours. Thank you.
That's a very important question. I want to answer it honestly because the perspective of African leader on this issue is not monotonic, and pretending otherwise will be intellectually dishonest. And Africans are not naive. They understand that debt forgiveness is not a permanent solution in isolation. Well, but what they are saying is that this, if you look at what the last, just as the introduction said, that the last United Nations General Assembly in 2025, the question raised by a lot of African leaders on, okay, let's come into a new arrangement, let's look at how we can. But the truth is, today's relief, you are worried about the future, so am I. But today's relief give a room for a well-planned future. When there is a forgiveness today, tomorrow will not. New leaders will not be worried about yesterday's mistake for a future obligation. So that's my point of view. That for a sustainable economy, to reduce evidence, empirical evidence is there. Look at what happened with Nigeria in terms of Paris Club relief. For some years, there's a little reduction in our cost to our debt to GDP ratio and also revenue. We are no more spending 90% of our revenue on debt servicing before you build. So honestly, just as I said earlier, it's something that African leaders need to consider, and it's debt forgiveness is really, really what noting for African country in order to plan for the future and for a sustainable economy.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Adeniran. So the floor is yours again. You can ask one question to the opposing debater, the opposite side, and they have 1 minute to respond to you. So I take it you already have your question. The floor is yours. Sorry, you're muted, please. You're muted. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, the host was not allowing me to move to mute myself. So my question is just to put into perspective, just as my friend here, my lady colleague have said that debt restructuring is, we have seen from reports that African countries are being charged at a higher risk because they believe African countries are at risk, and as well maturity are deemed short. And the question is, do you think even with restructuring, just as I've asked me earlier, restructuring, the required framework for debt for African countries will be implemented by creditor in order to see that repayment is due, even when they are negotiating a fresh term of loan?
All right,
All right.
Thank you so much. So hold on, please, Nelson, before you respond, so we can get the timer. So as is custom, you respond in a minute. Floor is yours. Timer, you can get us started. Thank you. The floor is yours. You can unmute, please.
All right, thank you very much. The question, if I get it right, is if there's adequate framework for creditor, right? So when it comes to loan borrowing, right, we need to understand that the agreement is on both sides, right? And I think the best thing now that African leaders need to put into consideration is to ensure that whatsoever loan and terms and conditions given to that particular loan is well grounded in an understanding of the agreements, not in most cases, when you look at loan that is being borrowed by African leaders, it's more of like benefits to the creditor, not the borrowers. So at this point, African leaders need to also understand how to structure their framework, their loan framework, their requirements, and the agreements that bounds this loan to favor their own their own nation or economic perspective, economic environment.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Time's up. So we'll be taking the closing statements now. I would want to get us started with that. But so far, it's been an expansive conversation on debt forgiveness and debt restructuring, and what is the pathway or the sustainable pathway forward for African economies. So you got us started on the opening statement, Mr. Nelson. So, Mr. Adeniran, if you could do the honors and give us your closing statements. In 2 minutes, please. Sorry, just a second. You can unmute. Timer, we have to restart. 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. And it has been an interesting conversation. And let me close on this note. Let me bring this note that everything we have debated today comes down to one fundamental question: not what is politically comfortable, not what creditors prefer, but what actually works for the people on the receiving end of this decision, which is the citizen of this African country. My Temitope has made thoughtful argument, but the heart of the restructuring position assumption that if you are a drowning person, you need to find a longer road to be able to pull you out. And one of the things I would like to put into consideration is I look at the likes of Zambia. Zambia in 2020, I think 2022, has been in the parliamentary discussion for the debt restructuring. It takes almost 3 years for that to come into place, which is something that is not. So when it comes to debt restructuring, arrangement and agreement all take a longer time. So Nigeria showed us a different path. If you look at the $18 billion counciled by the Paris, you see that this gives a lot of economic relief. A high amount of revenue can be used for social amenities and developmental projects. So I want us, each and every one of us, to know that even as the political will of our leaders may not be there, that we must make sure that at all costs, African nation must be able to plan according to their revenue in such a way that they reduce their debt profile in order for us to be economically sustainable for the future. The future generation await the present leaders to see that the future is planned. What will be the stake of our future generation when they look at the whole prosperity of this nation, and all they could say is, my country has a debt profile of over $1 trillion. But rather, they should make use of available revenue to plan judiciously for the development of his nation. Now, as much that we always borrow.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Deniron. Time is up. So over to you, Mr. Nelson. Closing statement, 2 minutes. Floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity. So on closing my statements is just two questions in my mind. Are we looking at a sustainable loan profile, or we just need to we need a short-term relief? Because when we're able to restructure our loan and have this bilateral agreement with our creditors, it gives us a long-term focus on sustainable debt profile. At least when we are able to negotiate and beat down the interest rate on every loan that is being taken, right, it gives us that opportunity to even take loans that have sustainable focus. And the secondly is that we also need to look at how the loan we're borrowing is translating into economic development. Are we borrowing loan for bridges and road, or rather than in technology, infrastructure, innovation hub that will give us higher return on investment? And when we are able to negotiate for a loan restructuring in a minimal or single digit interest rate, right, it gives us a capacity to be transparent, and also caution the leaders to know what to borrow and why to borrow, and when to borrow for this particular project. So we not just borrow for road infrastructure, rails, bridges that does not have major economic return on investment, rather than focusing on innovation of technology, agricultural technology, else that's something that will be able to give a country an economic environment that will enable them to pay back in due course, noting the fact that, the interest rate at which this loan is being borrowed is at minima and is competitive with the rest of the world. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Nelson. Thank you so much, Mr. Deniron. And with that, we've come to the end of the debate. Please, our audience, if you could give us a virtual round of applause to our two wonderful debaters, well appreciated. Thank you so much. It was quite an enlightening conversation, and we've learned a lot, and we're going to take this even as we move forward into the conversation. Thank you so much once again. All right, thank you. So we'll be going to the panel session proper. Do we have Mr. Olusegun on the call? I can see he's already here. So we're going to the panel session proper. Backroom, could you arrange the tiles? Thank you. Mr. Olusegun, can you hear us? Just a thumbs up.
Yes, I couldn't unmute myself, but now I can hear you. Yeah, I'm sure you can hear me as well.
We're honored to have you with us. Thank you too for joining us, Ms. Ekeruche. Thank you for joining. You're also part of the debate and watching the tit for tat as well. So thank you for joining as well. So I'll go on to read the bio. So to get us started on the panel conversation, we have the honor of welcoming Mr. Olusegun Onibinde, the co-founder of Budget Nigeria. Please, a virtual round of applause for him. A virtual round of applause. Thank you so much. So Mr. Olusegun Onibinde is a Nigerian civic technology leader, a co-founder of Budget, Africa's leading fiscal transparency organization. Through Budget, he has championed open governance, fiscal accountability, and citizen engagement across Nigeria and other African countries. Reaching over 32 million citizens, he has driven policy, advocacy, and public finance education. An Obama Foundation scholar at Columbia University, Mr. Olusegun also holds a master's degree in international policy and practice from the George Washington University and is currently a doctor of international affairs. Currently a doctor of international affairs candidate at Johns Hopkins University SAIS. His work has been featured by CNN, the New York Times, and The Guardian. He has received multiple recognitions, including the World Economic Forum Young Global Leader Award and New African Magazine's 100 Most Influential Africans. Please, with a resounding round of applause to welcome Mr. Onibinde to the panel. Thank you for joining, Mr. Onibinde.
Thank you.
So we're going on to our second panelist, Mr. Keruche. Just a second, so I can pull up the bio. So Ms. Amara Kerouche is a senior research fellow at the Center for the Study of the Economies of Africa, CSEA, I beg your pardon, Nigeria's premier economic think tank. In addition, she runs a column, Your Nigerian Economist, on STIRS, Africa's leading business publication. She holds a master's in economic policy from UCL University College London and a bachelor's degree in economics from Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, Ghana. Her interests, research interests, they confluence at the public finance and debt management, domestic resource mobilization, and macroeconomic management. Consequently, her research experience cuts across key issues in development, including public debts, South-South cooperation, and the impact of Chinese investment in Africa. You can find her work on Think 20, Brookings Institution, the International Center for Tax and Development, the United Nations Office on South-South Cooperation, and Southern Voice. She was awarded the IMF Youth Fellowship in 2020. Thank you for joining the panel, Ms. Amara Kerouche. It is our pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so just to get us started and a bit of background, the conversation today is on Africa's rising debt burden and the cost of borrowing. From our own research and the debt report which we published earlier this year, we see that the issue is not necessarily the size of the debt because African economies owe about approximately 1.8 to 1.9 of total global debt at the moment. And the total that number is about $2 trillion. So the question is, just to get us started, Mr. Olusegun, from your perspective and the work you do, since we pay double digits, about 8 to 15%, depending for multilateral debt, and other economies, they pay low single digits, 2 to 3%. What would it take to change the risk perspective that drives this premium for African nations?
I mean, thanks so much, Dabere Chukwu, and it's a pleasure being here on LEAP to discuss about LEAF. I have to get it right, to discuss about public debt in Africa, which has become a significant worry in recent times, especially, I mean, with the new push for like a credit rating framework for Africa as well. And I think it's always, there are many issues around public debt, but let me first start with your question. The risk premium in Africa exists for a reason. And if you look around us, it's always about the fundamentals that we carry, because obviously if people say we would likely default or we would restructure, they continue to carry those risks forward in some sort of way. And I guess to you to reimagine that risk is, for first, we need to be honest. What exactly is the macroeconomic condition for Africa? When we carry on external debt, what exactly are we using those external debt for? Because in my own view, this is a recent phenomenon again. Let's not forget where we're coming from. We, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, we took on a lot of debt, I mean, which were mostly either the World Bank debt or possibly we also had this Paris Club, London Club of Creditors that banded together to provide a sum of long-term debt to Africa. We came up in 2002, 3, 4, 5, and we had this debt aid that finally crystallized. Many African countries benefited from that. Then a lot of African countries were left that news. And before you knew it again, we were back into those concessionary debt, one. Then we also now found the euro debt very appetizing again. And so you look at Nigeria, if you make us a case study, we, after the exit of the Paris Club, our external debt fell as low as $4 billion. We were practically, we didn't have a lot of external debt, but between that and now, we've done almost 15 billion from euro bonds alone. Then by the time you put up the ID8s that we've taken from the World Bank and you look at AFDB and you look at maybe Islamic Development Bank, we've taken on close to another $25 billion. So in some sort of way, quietly, we saw ease, we saw a fiscal space, and we saw maybe credit that was available, and then we were dumped into it. And it goes back into, for Africa to really say our risk is different, it has to first ask itself, what is the intent of external debt? And considering we know the risk that comes with that. And if we do not ask that big question, because a lot of external debt that Africa continues to take, it seems it's for fiscal purposes, but it's some sort of monetary stability mechanism in some sort of way, because you find that most of them are to, keep the currency artificially low, artificially strong, to just manage the macro risk that comes with currency devaluation, and maybe inflationary tendencies. So I believe that sometimes African countries are not honest about the intention of their public debt, because World Bank has $500 million to give for a kind of program, maybe for health Nigeria would take $500 million for early education program from the World Bank. And I'm wondering, what happens to your public taxes? What happens to even taking a domestic debt if you want to really improve early child education within the country? And so, my own view, the intention within that debt also is a huge problem. But to really understand risk much is to look at it from the fact that there are legacy issues in terms of how people perceive us. We've gone through a debt forgiveness. We have Ghana with its challenges. We have Ethiopia with its challenges. We even have Kenya. It's already, there's a bit of rumors around in that play. So obviously, when you look at people looking the perception from the country as a whole, or the continent as a whole, is a big problem. Unlike Europe, when you look at Greece, which has worse macro fundamentals than most African countries, by the time you look at this debt GDP, but somehow still is able to borrow around 4% or 3%, it shows that it's benefiting from the contagion element that is part of the European Union. And I guess that's the first thing that Africa needs to do differently. I mean, maybe when you bring the entire stocks together and we band it together, our economy, and we be able to create this singular market, it improves the kind of risk perception that the continent is carrying. So I think there's an opportunity from being much more fiscally and integrated as an entity. And I guess that's the first point in my own view. And the second thing is also the intention of the public debt. As long as most public debt decisions are for monetary stability and are not tied in some form of self-liquidating assets to generate further foreign exchange to repay back this debt, we'll continue to have this crisis, this mismatch, and this crisis that comes with that contagion. And I think I will stop at that point.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Nibinde. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. Just to extend the conversation to Mara as well. Mr. Mara, the issue has come up, looking from 2008 to now, Africa's total debt has more than doubled in that time, and from about $510 billion now to over $1 trillion. So from your perspective and your research, how do we frame this? How do we view this from your research, from your perspective? The back room, if we can have her unmuted, please. All right, you're on mute
Okay.
now. Thank you.
All right. So first of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here. The question on how African governments are owing only 2% of global debt, but yet, we continue to face debt challenges. So first, 2% of global debt, but then we have a relatively smaller economic size. We also have a relatively smaller revenue base. And so that's why, even if, relative to other countries, even if we're borrowing less, debt continues to pose a challenge. Second, we have fewer alternatives compared to more developed countries. So, for instance, investments relative to other developed countries are significantly lower. Tax revenues as well, relative to other developed countries, are lower. The pool of sovereign wealth funds, of pension funds, we don't have as much to draw from. And so we continue, borrowing to finance our development agenda. Also, trade revenues as well are significantly lower relative to more developed countries. And then the third point is that for developing countries, we have to bear what economists call original sin. So when we develop, in most cases, we do not, or rather, when we borrow, in most cases, we do not borrow in our local currency. We borrow in, USD or the euro. And so what happens is when our local currencies depreciate, that means that in nominal terms, we have uh, our debt service payments are higher than we originally calculated, right? So that's the third point. And then the fourth point is that across the continent, um, very few debt management offices have the skill required to balance the terms and the structure of the debts that you're borrowing. So terms, when I mean terms, I'm talking about the maturity, and then when I mean structure, I'm talking about the composition, right? Um, we're borrowing from a range of creditors, official creditors, bilateral creditors, private creditors, at different interest rates. This needs a particular skill for you to balance, you know, um, this loan from official creditors versus loans from private creditors, right? In order that you avoid refinancing risks where a certain loan is coming due, but you don't have enough in your coffers, and so what you're doing is basically borrowing to pay off loans that are coming due, right? So that's one angle. Another angle is that for some of the debts that we take on, there's the maturity mismatch. Say we're borrowing for infrastructures, for an infrastructure project, and then the loan that you're taking on is a short-term loan. There's already a maturity mismatch, right? So those are some of the reasons why, even though we zoom out and in the bigger picture, we are borrowing relatively less than more developed countries. Debt continues to pose a challenge for us. And then moving on to the issue of risk, right, on the continent. To an extent, I agree that credit rating agencies have a point when they say that Africa is high risk, right? And so for that reason, we are charged a premium. However, the UNDP produced a study that shows that African countries lose $74.5 billion every year because credit ratings in most cases are subjective. The case of Greece was mentioned. You have Greece, you have Argentina. These countries have defaulted time and time again. Argentina has defaulted more than any African country, yet the capital markets are still open to them. Yet they don't borrow as high as we do, right? This is not to say that the markets are totally wary of us. After all, there are some African countries that have access to concessional finance, least developed countries, um, countries that are conflict prone, countries that are fragile as well, climate vulnerable countries. They still access loans at relatively um, low interest rates. However, for most of the continent, we continue to face this bias time and time again. So thank you. Over.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Karuchi. Just to stay on on what you said, just on that same part, we see, just for context, during COVID, we had the CCRT, the Catastrophe Relief Fund from the IMF, and it was designed as a kind of way to say, stop paying, interest on these loans. We'll pay off those interest on these loans, channel the money elsewhere. Of course, there was enormous pressure on healthcare during COVID. But to channel it down to these African economies, we've seen that the debt has ballooned from 510 billion in 2008 now to over a trillion. From your research, what can you let us in on how is it exploded, if we can use that word, in just a short space of time?
Okay, really great question. So there are supply side issues and there are demand side issues, right? For the supply side issues, within the period that you've mentioned, a lot more creditors have emerged. So we have the private creditors. More African countries now have credit ratings, and so they can now issue Eurobonds. This wasn't the case, before the multilateral debt relief initiative that the debaters, mentioned, where we were giving the debt relief. That wasn't the case. Very few African countries at that time could issue Eurobonds. So now we have, apart from even private creditors, we have non-traditional bilateral creditors now willing to borrow to African countries. We have the UAE, we have Saudi, we have Norway. Initially, it used to be mostly Paris Club creditors, right? So that's one. We also have a proliferation of Chinese financing. These Chinese loans do not come with as much conditionalities as, say, loans from the World Bank or loans from traditional bilateral creditors, say, like the US or the UK. And so for this reason, we see a lot more African countries leaning towards Chinese financing. Say they need to build a road or a rail in 2 years, you are more likely to get that money from the Chinese SOEs compared to, say, the World Bank, because the World Bank will ask for more conditions before they give you that loan. So that's for the supply side issues. Now for the demand side issues. African governments have significant development needs, right? And like I mentioned earlier, the pool of finance available to us is not as much as the pool of finance available to more developed countries. And so we have to lean on borrowing, which is not necessarily a bad thing if we can get it right, right? So the data shows that African governments need $130 billion to $170 billion annually just for infrastructure needs alone. We haven't talked about health, we haven't talked about education, we haven't talked about agriculture. And so for these sets of reasons, we see that there's been a significant rise in debt across the continent.
All right, thank you so much, Amara, for that. Just to extend the conversation and seek the perspective of Mr. Nibinde on this issue. Amara mentioned supply side issues and also, of course, the explosion of new lenders, especially Chinese bilateral lending from that time since the financial crisis. We look at the debt to GDP ratio. I think Nigeria, from OECD figures, currently stands at about just over 8%, which is quite low. African average is about 16%. Global average is almost 30% or just a little over 30%. So the question is, from your own perspective and with the current volatilities we have in the Nigerian economy, with oil, fluctuation in prices, with the war in Iran, what is your honest assessment of Nigeria's fiscal trajectory over the next 5 years?
So much. First of all, it's like you said, and I think when we first must unpack is on the issue of debt. Africa is not a country, and also local domestic dynamics also vary. For example, you look at a country like Sudan, or like which is 238% debt to GDP, or like Zambia, which is like around 105 percent debt to GDP, or you look like maybe Rwanda, South Africa, maybe in the 70s and in the 80s. Then you look at a country like Nigeria, we're in the 50s to the mid 40s to the 50s region. It might look like we're small and the headspace for more debt might be evident, but by the time we look at our debt service to revenue, and I'm talking about proper revenue because a lot of things that Nigerian government counts as revenue, it's not revenue in actual sense. It's more like a deficit financing management scheme. We are debt financing, debt servicing to GDP to revenue is around 75. It went as high as 90% at some point in time. So that's why even when you look at the public debt story, you must look at it holistically in a way. And if you there is no way that Nigeria would not seek some form of debt restructuring in the next 5 years. I'm making a big claim here, but I think it's something that would have to happen at some point in time. And I heard the Minister of Finance mentioning something along that lines in the last few days, because it doesn't just make sense for you to, and we've looked at Nigerians' revenue profile, as budget. No matter how much excitement we're getting about government is getting a lot of revenue currently, we are not pulling more than 20 to 25 trillion at maximum in terms of revenue. And I'm just stripping that of, putting things like grants inside debt, or even putting things around or GOE expenditure inside debt. No, proper revenue that we have is around 25 trillion naira. We have not even have that money. Even in 2025, we are not up to 25 trillion. When we are spending around 16 to 17 trillion naira on servicing debt. So there is no way we would continue in that dynamics. We will have to pay salaries, you have to run overhead, you have some statutory payments to make. And that's why we are in this self-perpetuating and maybe self-destructive cycle of constantly taking on new debt, considering that we do not have enough fiscal space. Unfortunately for the country, I believe the recent tax reforms that we made gave more benefits to the states than the federal government, because you took down the CIT to 25%, the federal government is not taking anything from the federal income tax. And I said Nigeria is a poor copycat of the US federalism, because I always benchmark Nigeria to the US federalism system. That the US federal system, the biggest revenue block for the US federal government is the income tax of its citizens. It's not corporate income tax, unlike Nigeria, and it's not the VAT, which is mostly regulated at state level. And so that's same, like the federal government gave away revenue, in my own view, gave away more concession on VAT, went to reduce CIT, and does not even take a penny from the income taxes from its citizens. So which means maybe reliance is on whatever is going to happen within the oil market that we know is highly leveraged already. So I feel like the federal government revenue challenges are not going away, except there's some gross level of efficiencies that is able to unlock in terms of collection. And that would force it to have huge conversation on the fact that certain debts have to be restructured. The other thing also is that I believe that there's more scrutiny of the price point of the credit rate of what the interest rate for this debt coming through come out, because the Buhari government, if you allow me to say the unfortunate Buhari government, took up so much debt in a very short time, especially at the external front, especially for Eurobonds payment, which sounded very exciting, 11, 12, 9, 7, 8%, depending on if you find it in the primary or secondary market. But the question is that Eurobond to what purpose? Was it used to elevate our electric transmission, generation and distribution framework? Were those Eurobonds used to grow, our competitiveness for non-oil export markets? We did not target those debt into those things. Most of them, like I mentioned, were used for monetary stability, and some of them even went for consumption, like payment of fuel subsidy. So those are the kind of. So I believe that as we go along the way, there's more interest to say, and that's why you see that our debt growth recently has been more on the concessionary side. We've gotten our high days around $18 billion with the World Bank currently, because you have like a 10-year moratorium, you are paying maybe at 3, 4, 5, 6% over maybe a 30-year period. It's like the sweetest deal you would ever find. But at the end of the day, you are still going to pay one day, and it's also adding up to your debt stock. So I guess we'll become more selective, because we're now clear-minded to say there's a huge implication, for you to take debt at a very high note. Finally, is to look at other options, and we're doing it already. Like Ms. Ikeruche mentioned, it's the fact of looking elsewhere. We did the Afrexim oil for debt swap, which the president did immediately got into office. So you might see those barter systems, those debt barter systems happening also as well, because they might sound much more nimble, and they can help to fix maybe immediate liquidity gaps in some sort of way. Currently, we are not in that place. We're taking a high risk here because we've taken our interest rate so high, so we are attracting up form of funds in portfolio investment. Reserves are swelling, but that's not going to last forever. At some point, people will want to exit and find that capital might flow elsewhere. It also means that we will have to build we will have to maybe leverage commodities for debt in the future. That's something that we did in the past with Project Egood, Project Gazelle, all those things where we were using NMPC's production to be able to get funding. It's something that might come to stay because it sounds much more straightforward for most lenders as well. But like my closing point, like IMF wrote in his Article 4 consultation report of being careful about sovereign debt. We're taking this $5 billion from the UAE. And while sovereign debt, it's a bit tricky because it would come to clauses that can even attack your sovereignty in the end. And we know a few African countries who are facing these challenges, the Zambia and Kenya as well. But it's also very important that we also think through clearly about, it might sound very exciting and appealing, what exactly are we taking debt for? And that's why there is no substitute, for being able to generate trade. There's no substitute to trade, because all of this old debt issue that Africa continues to find itself is just because it has not built a strong thesis and a strong case, for trade, either within itself or outside the continent, to generate the effects for either its import, its currency management, or either to pay some areas, whatever that means. And it continues to borrow to keep that shortfall. If Africa is able to invest much more in its trade capacity and be able to sell much more to the world, Brazil has around $125 billion from agricultural exports alone. If Africa takes even a quarter of that market, you understand, and generate effects at that great level, it's able to save some of its basic needs in some way and would be able to stop these concessionary opportunities or high price debt that it finds itself.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Olibinde. That was quite expansive. That was a deep dive. But staying on that current theme, I think one thing that has resonated so far in the conversation is about sustainability. Is this sustainable for public finances? And does this allow us plan, or are we just paying premiums and then spending the rest on salaries? So the question now, because I think Mr. Courage also touched on this on bilateral lending with Chinese loans. Just a bit of background. Some years ago, there was some kind of a joke, a running joke that that Zambia had defaulted on a Chinese loan on a concession, and it would imply that they would have to take over an airport in Lusaka, the capital. So, of course, the Chinese official came out to say that is false, that did not happen, and that was not part of the clauses. But I think it gets us to the issues of debt trap diplomacy, which Western lenders Western economies kind of warn the global South economies about, to say, look, you may say you want to go get a cheaper rate elsewhere, but we don't give you those kind of terms and the likes. But to draw that down to maybe Nigeria as a case study, would we say these loans have delivered development proportionate to the risk attached to them? The Chinese concession loans, the bilateral loans.
I would say number one, we are not, I mean, for the size of Nigeria's economy, our exposure to the Chinese loans has been very, very minimal. When you compare that to Ethiopia, to Kenya, to Zambia, so maybe a little bit of kudos in that direction. But we all, well, and also the Chinese are slowing down on that Belt Road Initiative. So it's not as grand as it used to be. Let's not forget, like maybe 5-6 years ago, there were even annual conferences and there were landmark agreements being signed in those places. So I think the Chinese are also walking back a little bit in terms of how they, because it was a form of diplomacy and projection of soft power for them. And I guess maybe they want to look elsewhere in that direction. So so that largesse might not be there as it used to be. But bilateral loans are also critical, because you are going to ask, where is liquidity happening globally? I mean, and the Gulf countries are awash with liquidity. I'm talking about UAE, Qatar. You would underestimate how much support. I think it's over $20 billion in the last 4-5 years that the Gulf countries have provided to Egypt in terms of debt support. Especially it's building a new city, and it's also even having FX and external debt management. It means, and Nigeria is trying to tap into that market also, with the UAE $5 billion initiative as well. There are a few run around here. Bilateral debt will happen, but it would come with clauses and conditionalities and covenants. And an example is what happened recently with the UK. The UK wants to give us some money here, but there's a trade finance element in it. There's a procurement element in it. There is, so it's not just a straightforward put cash in your pocket, because even though the Western countries might revile what the Chinese has done, but it seems that it's come more appealing in a way that they also bake in their own domestic opportunities in such loans, because the Chinese gave you those loans, but they build those roads, they build those bridges. So it's more like the entire value chain for them. So we would see more domestic, and I'm shocked that countries like the EU are not looking at Nigerian energy markets and coming heavily and saying, this old Russian dependence that we're trying to run away from, this is for us. This is time for us to exert and put more money into the pocket of Nigeria, and they'll just cut ourselves into those deals as well. And it's just no-brainer that those things will happen. So we will see more bilateral loans, but domestic concerns and would also just be heavily incited. The other part is also, I think, Africans will be more wary of Eurobonds, because there was a time it looked much more exciting, and I guess, in my own view, it was a very lazy way of raising money. It sounded too good to be true. You get issuing houses, you are in the market, and accounts are credited in less than 60 days, and off you go. Compared to you taking up a concessionary debt with the World Bank, you can be writing papers for 3 years and you don't get that money out. So it sounded good, but it also came with some form of a high risk and high interest. And I guess we will now have to worry a little bit more about where we go in that direction. And in the end, it's all about us raising the level of productivity within the economy. Without us doing that, all of this is not going to happen. There was going to be a continuous mismatch. And secondly, which means you can now improve domestic resource mobilization through efficiencies, which means you can now expand your external trade as much as possible. I mean, why is Nigeria pumping 1.8 million barrels of crude? When the UAE is with 4 million population is doing 3.54 million barrels of crude per day. So those are the efficiencies and productivity levels you have to unlock that get you out of this quagmire or these current challenges that we find ourselves.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Nubinde. To get your perspectives on a similar issue, Amara. The question has come up, a lot of African nations now, including Nigeria, they spend more of their budget on debt servicing than on key social infrastructure, including, of course, healthcare and also education. So the question is, at what point does it become unsustainable? At what point does it become unsustainable for Nigeria and for other African economies where we now spend a lot of public finance on debt servicing than on actual, capex or for infrastructure and for social priorities?
Okay, so really great question. For a lot of countries, debt is already unsustainable. 27 countries are already facing high risk of debt distress. And then 9 countries are already in debt distress. Now, this is across developing countries, but most of these countries are in Africa. With regards to the ratio between debt service payments and education and health spending, for a lot of countries, it's almost a 1-for-1 ratio. Countries like Gabon, Cameroon, they spend as much on debt service payments as they would on education and health. And this has dire consequences, not just for now, not just for the current generation, but also for future generations, where limited investments in schools, in healthcare facilities, would affect the productivity of future generations, and also, affect definitely increase poverty levels, worsen, if it's affecting productivity, worsen job creation, worsen entrepreneurship and innovation as well. It has second order effects, migration, increase in migration, and so the debt situation has very dire implications on also development objectives.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much on that. So we already see that from what you say that a lot of countries is already unsustainable. And maybe just to touch on that a little bit, we see advanced economies. We hear, for example, the Japanese economy. They've borrowed up to 250% of their GDP. And we look at African economies and we say, so what is a safe level? Where does the red light come on? Is it at 100%? Is it at 50%? Would you share your perspective on that? Where do we say for typical African economies, or even for the major players, Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, is it sustainable to aim towards the Japanese level or the American level of debt, or should we have a hard stop? How do we work that out?
Okay, really good question. So we definitely should not aim to have the same debt to GDP levels as Japan or the US. Again, the terrain is very different. Back to the original sin theory, back to our capacity. We don't have the economic base and the revenue base to navigate such high debt levels. That being said, with regards to the threshold, the right threshold, the African Monetary Cooperation Program, AMCP, puts the appropriate debt to GDP threshold at 60%. Now, some countries haven't yet gotten to that 60% and they're already facing challenges. Some countries have exceeded 60% and they're still not being categorized as being in debt distress. So it depends on the specific country characteristics. For instance, if you're commodity dependent, then you may want to watch your debt to GDP threshold, because the moment there are volatilities in that commodity market, whether it's oil or gold or copper, what seems like the appropriate threshold immediately becomes a problem if there's a volatility in another market, so that would be my response.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Karuchi, for that. Over to you, Mr. Odiminde. We see similar to what Mr. Karuchi has said. We talked about healthcare spending and having less money to walk around to pay for capital expenditure in these natures, and also social spending. At what point does this stop becoming a fiscal management problem and now becomes a human development problem? Because if you're paying premiums for these concessions, then obviously you have less money to work around with for other critical infrastructure.
Thanks so much. And I guess, and I like your question so much because debt is not a fiscal problem. It's not a monetary management problem. It's also is an human development problem. And that's why, people should exercise a lot of caution when it comes to taking on public debt, especially external debt. The way, if you take domestic debt, you can inflate your economy, you can print your money, and you can pay out that money. You do not control settlement of debt when you take it in external currency. So invariably, if you have 100 naira and I've made a place and you spend 70 naira maybe on debt servicing, the chunk is going to either domestic or external creditors. You have little money to do human development. Then what do? You go borrow money again to do human development. You continue in that cycle, and that's why there has to be a broad conversation about responsibility on the side of African governments. Because we could talk about the fact that we need much more lower premiums, we need to improve perception. Well, if we keep going back to those markets and we keep tapping into those liquid environments, which mostly are outside Africa, it becomes a huge problem in some sort of way. So my own advice is that there has to be, as we're trying to talk about concessionary debt and management of public debt, the domestic responsibility that comes with that also has to appeal in a much more stronger way. The other part that needs to go side by side with that is accountability. When the IMF was providing the debt for Nigeria, this short-term support, the SDR support that we got during the COVID-19 period, that had been retired, there were some conditions that were attached to that, and that included the fact that there's some transparency levels that the country had to unlock, which created these opportunities for the open treasury platform, that where the federal government posts daily expenditure, daily spending, and post that online. So also some of this public debt has to be, and I guess it's part of the lessons that there has to be some accountability mechanism that has to be embedded into these programs, because that's why a lot of African government they loved Eurobonds. There were no conditionalities. You can write whatever you want to write in the prospectus, but you are not bound to expend the Eurobond proceeds on whatever you put in the prospectus. In fact, most of what you put in the prospectus of the Eurobonds, you do not need external debts to settle them. You mostly are going to still be settled with the domestic currency. So there has to be a way to, beyond the responsibility that comes with raising public debt, the accountability, much more multi-layered accountability mechanisms that happen around that. Those things have to get on board, because else the human development side of that in the years to come will continue to evolve, and then we begin to wonder, where did all of this money come? Because I have huge problems with the scale of Nigeria's Eurobond as of now, something that didn't exist 9, 10 years ago, but we are servicing at a very high premium. We've devalued our currency, which means that a chunk of what the money that should have come to us in Naira is now used to service those Eurobond payments. We can delay high DA, but you can't even, you cannot create a perception that you're going to either want to restructure or you want to defer on those payments. And maybe in countries like next year, we're going to have a major chunk in terms of for retirement of those Eurobonds. So those are the issues that would germinate or would evolve as we go along the way. So apart from responsibility and accountability, the other thing also Africa also has to look into is domestic capital markets. If there are opportunities to tap in, and we used to do that, state government did that in the 2000s, and federal government did that, but it seems that we've neglected this domestic fundraising. And so if it's something we want to also raise funding from the capital market, for the bond market, it's something worth exploring, because defining the purpose of debt should to also lead into that trajectory about what kind of debt do we need at that point in time. And I guess that's the key point of mine. If it's a domestic issue that do not require an external currency servicing or usage, why do we want to raise external debt for it? If it's something that we know we are trying to open up a productivity line and this is going to generate trade opportunity for us in the long run, then we can go ahead and do that. So the purpose of debt also has to be linked into the type of debt being acquired by the government, because if that's a mismatch in that, we continue on this crisis. Finally, in my view, is the countries that have done great. I mean, there are some countries that debt levels are still relatively low. They're even still borrowing below the average premium within Africa. There has to be some way to understand what have been the key levers that have made their macroeconomic levers more stronger. And I guess it's all about productivity. Countries prioritizing productivity and external trade growth above anything else. If you put that levers down, you employ your people in the process, your NFX in the process, and you can try and rebalance the economy in sort of way. And things also like, integrated value chain. For example, look at how much weight that has been lifted off Nigeria's neck with the Dangote refinery. A chunk of our import bill was tied into importing fuel. Some at inflated numbers. Some were even used as conduit to launder public funds or to launder FX out of the country. But now with that opportunity drying up, you can find a way to rebalance the economy in some sort of way. And so that's why I think there has to be some holistic thing about African countries looking at this whole obsession with debt. It speaks heavily about the problem with productivity, with trade, and also domestic resource mobilization and the efficiencies that come with it. Fixing all of that levers will help us rethink how we take public debt in a much more careful way. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Onibinde, for that. I think staying on that, same line, if we're having this discussion with policy advisors to ministers of finance across African governments, they'll say, we don't already generate enough revenue, and we see this as maybe the only viable way on how we can move forward. So the question now is, since a lot of African economies don't generate enough revenue as it stands to facilitate their own development needs, how important is domestic resource mobilization to these nations?
I mean, it's critical, but you cannot tax. You have to create will to tax it. And I guess that's what a lot of African countries don't understand. Everybody wants to go on a taxation binge, but at the end of the day, if there is no productivity and economic growth in the economy, it's not taxation itself becomes a destructive element. So my own view is don't look first from the position of what can I tax. Think first about how do we generate value within this economy. And I guess when you look at the total trade of Africa as a whole, it's far less than what you find even domestic, some even single Western countries, what they generate as much as possible. And I guess, and I've given an example of Brazil generating around $125 billion from agricultural exports only. And does it mean Africa does not have arable farmland? Yes, we have arable farmland. Yes, we have the workforce. Yes, we have the machine. We can get those machineries. Yes, we can invest in the seed science that can make those things possible. And do we want to do it? Is that what it will take debt to do so that we can capture part of that market? And that's what I would want African governments to think through. It's about how does debt expand our productivity levels and or give opportunity for us to be able to generate value and now be able to capture it and now even possibly be able to tax it. And if you don't get that dynamics right and you say, we will build it and they would come, like go say, maybe, okay, I feel like building a rail to Maradi. And you go take $1 billion and put the rail to Maradi, and you have to ask yourself, is that what exactly is the size of trade in Niger Republic? Are there other alternative routes for logistics for Niger Republic that could go through Benin Republic? And those are the things you have to ask, that what productivity am I unlocking by doing this? If Nigeria is taking public debt to unlock productivity in the non-oil sector, yes. Even if it's in the oil sector that we want to be able to put another 100, 200, 500,000 barrels of oil, yes, I can hear from that. And then we know that those debts will be settled down the line another 5 to 10 years. But, taking that to say we want to go take on mosquito nets, or we have a safe motherhood delivery program and we would need to take another $500 million. And I'm like, this is not what we should be doing. And so, in my own views, African leaders must understand that we must be able to generate growth and generate sustainable growth. First, that should be like the fundamental premise, and capturing those growth efficiently and now being able to tax that growth efficiently. The other thing also that has to do is reevaluating assets so that it's much more optimal. I was making a joke yesterday about you might have a $2 million house in the US, for example, and you would not run away from paying around $20,000 to $25,000 as a property tax in the US. You cannot run away from that because property tax practically runs the public school systems within the US. In Nigeria, you can have a $2 million property house in Banana Island in valuation, but you are paying 150,000, 500,000 as tenement rate, per year. And so my question will be, you have not properly classified the value of that asset so that you can effectively tax it. There's a bit of mismatch in terms of, asset valuation even in Nigeria to properly tax it. And I guess within the real estate environment, there's still a gross mismatch to be able to optimize what is happening within that environment. The assets are being traded in Nigeria, moved from one place to another, but is government capturing the VAT properly as it's supposed to be? Is that being decentralized effectively enough? So those are the kind of things that has to happen in the domestic resource mobilization side of things. That how do you generate growth, and how do you properly qualify assets that you have currently so that you properly tax them at the rate which is much more effective? And how do you bring an integrated digital environment for you to do that? Because I still feel when you look at tax to GDP in Africa, it's still incredibly low. 6%, 8%, average in the continent around 11%. A country like Nigeria is even far lower than that. How do you be much more effective with that? So, and I guess once you do that, then now you cannot talk about, okay, we need debt, and debt for what purpose as well as much. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Olubinde, for that. That was another deep dive, well appreciated. Over to you, Mr. Karochi. At least from what we hear from Mr. Olubinde, grow it, then tax it. I think that is how we can summarize that. Grow the sector before we implement the taxes, before we tax. So, from a perspective on domestic resource mobilization, a lot of African economies will say they do not generate enough revenue for their development needs and for the expenditure they want to make on infrastructure. So how or should they lean on domestic resource mobilization? How deep should they lean on it? Should that be maybe a sort of crutch? What do you think?
Okay, so great question. To an extent, I agree with the theory of growing the economy before you tax it. That being said, I think there are steps the government can take outside of increasing tax rates. There are a lot of issues around tax evasion and tax avoidance. Nowadays, countries are using technology to improve the efficiency with which they collect tax and also with which they manage tax revenues. So that's one. Secondly, there are other forms of taxation that do not have a direct impact on the pockets of the average citizen. I'll give an example. Um, there's the UN Convention on Multinational Enterprises Tax that is seeking to implement a minimum corporate tax rate for all multinational corporations rather. I think that the minimum corporate tax rate is 15%, so that's one. And also seeking to tax these corporations as a single entity. So, for instance, we will no longer tax Google as Google Nigeria or Google US or Google UK. We will tax Google as Google, and so cases where Google has, is routing their profits via a tax haven, and so is avoiding tax, you can easily curb that, right? So that's one tax form that doesn't directly affect, the pockets of citizens. Others are taxing state-owned enterprises, SOEs, um, withholding tax as well, resource rent tax. I think the property tax has been mentioned already. That's another great form of taxation. Um, and what else? Let me see. Stamp duties as well. Yes, and also revisiting tax holidays. A lot of African countries have tax exemptions, tax holidays that may have been efficient or effective in the past, to incentivize investments in certain industries, but have long overstayed, and are no longer as effective or as efficient as they should be. So those are some suggestions that I have on mobilizing domestic resources, which by the way are very critical, because when you mobilize domestic resources, you are no longer thinking about investing only in areas where you have returns on investments. Um, you can invest in areas where there may not be as much returns on investment, but they are good for your people, right? So you have agency over the use of that money. Thank you. Over.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Keruchi. Just to stay with that thought, I have if you permit, a double-barreled question here. On one side, we see African economies leaning towards domestic borrowing, and of course, there are obvious challenges with domestic borrowing, but we see a lot of African economies leaning on their local financial sector to, in essence, help out in times of difficulty. And on the other hand, we have debt restructuring from African economies like Ghana and Zambia. So, on one hand, for domestic borrowing, we want to know how sustainable is this for African economies? Nigeria as a case study. And on the other hand, in line with what Ghana and Zambia is doing regarding restructuring their debts, what lessons are there to be learned? Should we follow one or the other? Are both viable paths? What would you advise? An African nation like Nigeria to take moving forward?
Okay. Really great but difficult questions. For the one on domestic borrowing, domestic borrowing is not necessarily a bad thing, although it, evidence has shown that it crowds out the private sector, because then the private sector doesn't have as much financing to leverage on. But it's not a bad thing if only it is matched, if only the term and the structure of the loan, if it's gotten right, right. So say for instance, you want to um, finance an infrastructure project. um, Domestic borrowing may not be what you want to leverage on, because most domestic loans are on the lower end of the maturity spectrum. Um, However, there are certain projects, in the development agenda that may be well suited for domestic borrowing. Another advantage of domestic borrowing is that because it is taken on in your local currency, you're not exposed to foreign exchange risks. So if there's depreciation in your local currency, you're not exposed to that. So to summarize that, domestic borrowing is not a bad thing. You just have to get it right in terms of the projects that you're financing with the domestic borrowing. Moving on to the debt restructuring question. For the countries that we have interviewed on debt restructuring, whether it's Chad, whether it's Zambia, or whether it's Ghana, they all say the same thing. If you can avoid it, please do. Because the restructuring process takes an extremely long time. It was pointed out earlier, for Zambia, it's between 3 to 4 years, and they're still not yet done. During that time period, that country can't access capital markets. You can't get finance from anywhere. Your investors are wary. Your credit rating is you're basically considered credit unworthy, right? So if you can avoid debt restructuring, if you can manage your debt in such a way that you don't have to restructure, then you're better off, right? And some suggestions that have been put forward is, first, okay, so let me backtrack a bit. One reason why debt restructuring is now more challenging than it used to be is because of the broad range of creditors. So now we have private creditors that uh, some economists call them vulture funds, right? So they are not as willing to restructure their debts as was the case in the early 2000s, where creditors were willing to work with debtor governments to restructure their debts. These private creditors are not as willing to restructure their debts. Even China, within China, you have government entities that borrow, but you also have private sector entities that borrow. And so you basically have to sit with each creditor to get the appropriate restructuring terms. So the process has become too complex for countries. So that being said, one of the suggestions, or a few of the suggestions that are being put forward for debtor governments, is when you're taking on loans now, include certain clauses. One of them is the collective action clause, CAC clause or CAC clause. What this clause does is that decisions made by a majority of your creditors are binding on all other creditors. So let's say you have official creditors, you owe 65% of your debt to official creditors and then the rest to private creditors. If the official creditors agree that this debt should be restructured from reducing this interest rate from X amount to X amount, increasing repayment period from 5 years, just as an example, to 10 years, that decision now becomes binding on even creditors that were not in agreement, right? So that's the collective action clause. Another clause is the most favored nation clause, which basically means that you cannot treat one creditor any worse off than you're treating the others. So if you give, say, China or a private creditor a better restructuring term, um, you have to do that for all the other creditors, regardless of how aggressive or less aggressive those other creditors are. Thank you. Over.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Kerridge. I really appreciate the answer there, and it was also quite the loaded question. Thank you for doing justice to that. So, moving over to Mr. Oniminde, we have sustainability bonds, and the question is, sustainability linked bonds. How do we ensure that this can improve investment opportunities for African nations? And is this something that more African nations should lean into, for these kind of bonds?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that Africa needs to, and I guess I like the response from Ms. Amara, and I guess we will have to tap into different directions. I'm a fan of bonds that are tied to project linked funds and bonds. So that's why I'm a fan of like Sukuk, I'm a fan of of green bonds, because I mean even if let's assume that there's a mismatch in terms of project prioritization, but at least I can see the project. At least I can see the road that Sukuk had built. I don't know the roads that Eurobond built. I don't know, maybe I'm very critical of Eurobonds. My apologies, but I don't see what Eurobonds. So I like project linked debt. I mean, it's much more. There's much more clarity, and you can build accountability mechanisms around the quality. You can do like the external appraisal validation, and you can be able to embed accountability frameworks into it. So I think it's something most African countries should lean in, because that way, because we're getting to a time where, I mean, an example is the public perception of this debt. Recently, there was a World Bank made maybe a tweet or a post about Nigerians' debt, about, they have approved maybe some money for Nigeria. And you need to see the responses by Nigerians on that post with anger, with venom, saying, and I guess if you were sitting back and as a World Bank executive reading all of that, and you're looking at this is the third country on the high deal list after Indonesia and Bangladesh, you'll be asking questions. Are we not supposed to start slowing down if there is some form of venom or anger, against this kind of debt? So invariably, I believe that the managing perception and citizen acceptance of some of these debts is also very, very important. And I believe that if you do things like sukuk and brain debt loan, you invite a bit of trust, into the mechanics. And I guess people will be like, oh, we borrowed $2 billion for what? And people have clarity about that. Because like I mentioned in the initial opening point, most public debts in Africa are disguised as a form of fiscal support program, to build another road, to build another school. But if you look deeply into it, most of them are monetary management, tools that they are trying to do reserve management, price some certain existing debt and all of that. So it's very important that Africans, we take debt that is much more linked to project. I guess that would invite trust, because it's an understated part of what we have not discussed. What exactly is the citizen trust in all of this? When they believe that future public revenues have been mortgaged or have been hemorrhaged because we are taking debts on today. When they believe that some of those debts could be managed, could be wasted. So those questions they have to be that they're taking on debt to raise maybe the infrastructure stock level of the country, and that means future generations can benefit from that as well. I mean, if we took debt to build Third Mainland Bridge, and I've been driving on Third Mainland Bridge for more than 20 years now. I mean, I still feel like I use Third Mainland Bridge. So even if you're taking part of my taxes to service a debt body language. That still feels as if there's some intergenerational equity in that direction. But if I take in debt on something that I do not benefit or enjoy from it, it's a bit of challenge for you to engender trust in that dynamic. So it's something the federal government themselves or even African governments must also look at trust and intergenerational equity when it comes to raising public debt.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Olivinde. Trust and equity in raising public debt. So, as we're about to round up and go into the questions, wanted to get your final words on policy reform. So, if there was one recommendation you could make now, say, to the finance minister or to finance ministers across, African economies, to enable us have a more sustainable debt profile and to enable us ensure that we plan for the future and for posterity, what would that be and why? And also for everyday investors and retailers interested in the African economy, why should they care about Africa's public debt? Final word, sir. Thank you.
I mean, my charge to finance ministers or planning ministers is debt is not free money. It's something that everybody has to first accept, irrespective of how generous the terms are, especially external debt. You would have to pay back at some point. So an extra caution needs to be applied to when you are trying in public debt because you're servicing public revenues in the future. You are also you are putting there are also macroeconomic dynamics that happen when your debt to GDP keeps rising or maybe your debt servicing ratios to revenue keeps rising. So not free money. The second thing is also be careful of mismatch. What are you borrowing for? I mean, if it's something you could sort of domestically do it. If it's something that requires more bilateral funding tied to trade finance, do it. It's something that is also going to expand your non-economy or non-commodity economy, even expand your commodity exports, and you need debt for that. Go ahead and do it. So there has to be a proper match, to what you're borrowing for and what exactly kind of debt you're acquiring. And the last point is building public trust is extremely important because it seems take on debt and we're going to keep taking it, but there has to be some form of a multi-stakeholder dialogue and engagement in terms of how we take public debt because you're doing this debt on behalf of the people and they need to be carried along in that direction as well.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Olibinde. So over to you, Mr. Keruchi. Same question on policy reform. We're on the hotline to finance ministers across Africa, and you've been called to give this expert opinion. Where do we focus on policy reform to make debt sustainable or be on the path to sustainable debt for Africa? And for investors, they could be novel investors or first-time investors with interest in the African economy. Why should they care?
Okay. So my first policy recommendation would be for policymakers to look beyond debts. There are a range of financing options that are available to African governments, from trade revenue to tax revenue to sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. So it's important to explore these options to the fullest. That would be my first recommendation. And then my second recommendation would be to acquire the skills that enable us to design debt contracts better to suit our local context. These skills and these debt contracts are already available in several countries, particularly Latin America. So I'll give a quick example. States contingent debt instruments, right? If most of your revenue is coming from oil, there are debt contracts where you can peg your debt service payments such that if oil revenue or oil price is below a certain threshold, your debt service payments automatically stop or they reduce, right? So that's just one example. I already spoke about other clauses. And then debt management. So design debt contracts to suit our local context and improve debt management strategies. And then with regards to why investors should care. Let me start off by saying why African governments should care, right? So, at a macro level, unsustainable debt makes a country look extremely bad in the eyes of investors, in the eyes of trade partners. Being credit unworthy, right? It simply means that partners can't trust you to keep your word if you can't service your debt. And then for investors, um, well, I don't necessarily think that Africa's debt problem can be addressed by investors. Where I think investors may come in is with regards to not overly relying on the credit ratings that credit rating agencies provide, and but rather coming to the continent and seeing things for themselves, right? The continent is not as um, risk prone as these credit rating agencies put us or show us to be, right? So that would be my suggestion for investors.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Karoche. Thank you so much, Mr. Nibinde. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your perspectives and experience on these issues. I just pray your indulgence for a few minutes so we can take questions from the audience. Um, we'll just get us started on the first one here. So I will start with you, sir. How do debt affect the sovereignty and decision-making capacity of African countries in global politics?
I mean, I I feel like when you hold somebody, there's a noose on your neck a little bit. But we also have to agree that we're in an interconnected world where, I mean, the creditor needs the debtor, the debtor needs the creditor, they both need each other. The thing, like Ms. Amara said, is about what did you covenant to and what did you agree to, and are you doing all your best to meet into those rules? And I guess. Debt is also a form of soft power. There's a diplomatic element into it. I mean, those institutions like the World Bank, IMF also exist for certain reasons. They are one of the frontiers of Western economic orthodoxy. So invariably, they want it exists for that reason. So and there's a reason why the Chinese also are there. There's a reason why the German, the French, everybody, even the UK now, is beginning to invest much more in trade, and they're dialing down on grants and on development funding. So there's, I just say it's on the side of it's about self-awareness and responsibility on African governments to understand what they are getting into. Because people say lightning does not strike twice. We've gotten the debt service, gotten the debt forgiveness, like Ms. Amara said, and I guess you could imagine that was a campaign that lasted almost 2 decades. There have been dead aid concerts, and the debt relief started way back in the early 1980s, and something that now crystallized up to like in maybe 2005 before we now got those opportunities, and the Catholic Church was on it. They call it the year of Jubilee. There different things came in and different pressure points for us to get there. So it doesn't sound okay, go back in that same route. So there has to be some form of intentionality into the kind of deals we get in at the sovereign perspective, because irrespective of change of government or whatever happens, we will still be bound by this decision making as well. The other thing to also worry about is some of them are not even straightforward, like contingency debts that we get ourselves into. I mean, the PEI and D deal that Nigeria almost got almost $20 billion or something that they almost got as judgment in the UK before all of that was quenched. Things like that. African governments, you might not even take on public debt, but you could get yourself into a form of arrangement and you cancel and you go back on your word, and someone goes into an arbitration and gets a sizable judgment against you, and is even to take maybe your debt or maybe just go to JP Morgan and take a chunk of your reserves. Those are things that are also very realistic. So it's about intentionality to, like you said, the capacity building to manage them effectively and to make the right decision at the time.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Olumide, for that. Well, we're going to Mr. Karoche for the second question. It says, considering that many African countries spend more on debt repayment than on education, than on healthcare, should debt forgiveness be seriously considered instead of debt restructuring? I don't know if this person was here for the debate, but that's the question. Should we consider forgiveness altogether? I mean, it's the same. Discussion we've had at the UN General Assembly. Is that the sustainable discussion moving forward?
Okay, really good question. Um, Sadly, the decision of whether a country should engage in debt restructuring or should ask for debt forgiveness is not solely dependent on the debtor government or the borrowing country, right? Um, Debt forgiveness is not easy to come by. I know Mr. Unigbinde just mentioned that the multilateral debt relief initiative that we benefited from in 2005, where 12 billion out of our $18 billion debts was forgiven, is a one-off experience or should be a one-off experience, right? Let's take a step back. We're living in a world where countries are more protectionist, right? So there are a lot of economic protectionist policies. We're living in a world where countries are trying to conserve their resources for their own citizens. And so these countries are not as willing to let go of the money that they have lent to us in bearing in mind that they are very aware of our own challenges when it comes to fiscal management or debt management. You know, they see how our governments spend money. They're not as willing to let go of that money, right? They also need the money for their citizens. So that's talking about official creditors. Now, for private creditors, these are banks, right? Credit Suisse, all the big banks, right? These are pension funds in European countries that have you know that are in the capital markets, right? They are not, these are people's monies, these are citizens' monies. We're no longer talking at the macro level where you would say it's government money. No, these are citizens' money, right? And a 70-year-old Argentinian lady has given a pension fund in Argentina her money to invest. And that pension fund has invested that money or has borrowed that money to an African government, right? So they can't go back to the 70-year-old Argentinian lady and tell the lady, oh, we've forgiven the African governments and they don't have to pay us back. So what is the lady going to do, right? So that's it's not going to be possible, right? And it's where it's we're in a particularly difficult situation because now a lot more African governments have debts like that. A lot more African governments now owe debts to private creditors, right? No more Paris Club creditors where you can engage with them and more easily, get debt forgiveness or even restructure debts to more favorable terms. So again, like I mentioned earlier, the best position is for you not to be is for a country not to get to the position where it would need to restructure its debt or where it would need to start asking for debt forgiveness. Debt management at the onset, whether in designing better debt contracts or in managing the debts or like the better use of debts or of loans, that's where we have to start addressing the issue at. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for that. Quite expansive and much needed conclusion to this discussion. Thank you so much, Ma, for that insightful answer. So we'll be bringing the program to a close. I want to say special thank you to the panelists, Miss Ma Ekeruche and Mr. Onibinde. I want to thank the debaters, Mr. Nelson and Mr. Adeniran, who got us started early and got us, got the conversation rolling with the debate on debt restructuring and debt forgiveness, which has, also taken center stage in this discussion. We want to also say thank you to the guests. A lot of you arrived early. You've been with us from the beginning up until now, and we really appreciate you. We know today is a work day, so you have to take out time from your busy schedule. Same with our panelists and our debaters. So thank you so much. We truly appreciate. For Leave Africa, we thank the research team. And please, if you can just give a special round of applause virtually to the research team. They did a whole lot of work putting together the Debt Africa, the Debt Story report. It was quite insightful and is the background for the program we just had today on sustainable debt for African economies. We thank the leadership at Leave and the departmental leads as well as the associates as well. Thank you for putting together this insightful program. And please, let's keep the conversation going. Once again, for our panelists, thank you. We appreciate it. We know it's a work day, so having to join us, midday, it's a lot, and we'll come knocking once again. Thank you so much. Any final words to get us close out, Umar and Mr. Nubinde?
I mean, thank you so much. It's a pleasure, being here. And I would say thanks so much to Mrs. Mara Keruche. It's been great conversation. And I know that this would filter into the years of the policymakers in Africa and would challenge and change things gradually. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you.
Same here. Thank you to Leave Africa, and thank you, Mr. Onibinde. This has been an enlightening conversation, and I look forward to future partnerships. Thank you.
All right. Thank you once again. Have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone. Bye.